Hi, so this is chapter 17, Evolution of Animals. Have your outline nearby as we go through the evolution of animals. And you guys, you'll need to, we're going to go through lots of different kinds of animals in this chapter. So make sure you remember the general characteristics of each animal group or phyla we talk about, and then choose like one animal to become your poster child for that group. And hopefully you'll remember the characteristics with just remembering one animal. So here's a little cartoon for you at the beginning. You can go ahead and read that. So what's the definition of an animal? So these first four is the biological definition. All animals must be, number one, eukaryotic, multicellular, heterotrophic, right? And again, heterotrophic means that you obtain nutrients or organic molecules, really organic nutrients by ingestion, and animals are able to digest their organisms inside their bodies. Animals lack cell walls, right? Plants and fungi have cell walls, but not animals. And then most animals fit these three. So there's going to be some exceptions to the rule. There's a very wide variety of animals on the planet that fit these four definitions. But when we think of an animal, right, like this python up here, or the poor deer or antelope of whatever he's eating, we think of these animals, they are going to fit these characteristics. So they're diploid, animals reproduce sexually. Most animals can move, of course. They have muscles in the nervous system to help them move. And they go through the same life cycles in development. So what are those life cycles? So as an embryo, we all, animals, right, we all go through these stages. So we have a sexual reproduction. So we have a sperm and an egg. These are haploid cells. And we're going to fuse to make a zygote. This is a 2N. And then that zygote undergoes many replications of mitosis to make, first an egg cell stage, and et cetera, et cetera. We're going to divide more and more, and pretty soon we're going to form a blastula. So the embryo of all animals will form a hollow ball, and then that hollow ball will go on and form different kinds of structures and different tissue types. But these initial stages where you have a blastula and a gastrula, those are conserved. So all animals will have these stages of development, which is what number 4 means. Okay, so let's look at letter B, evolution. I know it might say letter C in your outline. That's a mistake. I should be a letter B. But so animals were thought to evolve from a colonial flagellated protist way, way back when. And then during the Cambrian explosion, there was a huge boom, or an explosion of different body plans and different kinds of animals. So if you look at your A, B, and C here, right, the oldest animal is the fossil we found is about 560 million years old. There's many new body plans and new phyla. Phyla is the second group under kingdom, right? So we're talking about the kingdom Animalia. And then there's different kinds of phyla, right? And they all think to have, or not all, but there was a big explosion of the different kinds of animals here. And why, right? So that's the question on the PowerPoint. And there's 3 reasons why they think the animals had this big boom in the Cambrian explosion. So number 1 is that there's a complex predator-prey relationship. So because more and more organisms that inhabit the water, remember life evolved in the water, so it gets crowded. And when you have crowding and limited resources, you're going to have competition and predator and prey relationships that become more complicated here. So that's going to drive adaptations to help one organism, right, succeed in this complex predator-prey relationship scenario. Also, the atmosphere is changing. So we have this atmosphere that now can allow animals to hop onto land, first for short periods of time, and then slowly over many, many thousands of years, animals will become solely terrestrial. So we have this movement onto land because the environment on land has changed. And then also, this is the 3rd one, so you need to add this. I realized I didn't put this in your notes, but the homeotic genes were thought to evolve here. So remember those homeotic genes we talked about in the evolution chapter, where a small mutation or a duplication of these genes can cause a really huge change in the body plan. You can go from having, you know, 4 limbs to 6 limbs or 6 limbs to 4. So you can just really dramatically change your body plan. So for those 3 reasons, they think that's why we have such a big explosion during this Cambrian period. So go ahead and read this question. Go ahead and pause the lecture and then I'll tell you the answer. Okay, so if you read the question and you looked at the choices for your answers, it's basically what I just went over. So A, B, and C are all reasons why we think that multicellular animals appear very, very rapidly during this time. All right, so your answer is going to be letter D, all 3. All right, so now let's look at Roman numeral 2 for animal structure. So when you classify animals into groups, one of the categories that scientists use will be what shape they have. So it's called symmetry. And if you look at your outline, there are 3 kinds of symmetry that your animals will have. And actually, number 1 is basically no symmetry, which is not a symmetry at all, right? So there is an animal, the sponges, and you know, that's kind of a weird thing. A lot of people are surprised that sponges are considered animals, but they are. So sponges are actually animals, but they don't have a symmetrical body. So they're going to be asymmetrical. So sponges also don't have internal organs. So their insides don't have to be organized in a very special way, the way that our bodies are. And they have very little tissue organization. So they're sort of like the most quote unquote old or primitive kind of animals to be still on the planet that maybe resembled, you know, something very early on, but they still retain a very sort of unorganized or not as organized body plan. So they can actually have completely asymmetrical bodies. They can, you know, have very different shapes. Other animals, though, fall into these 2 categories where they are either have radial symmetry or bilateral symmetry. Radial symmetry means that you do have a distinct top and bottom, but there's no way you can look at this animal and say left or right, right? Because you go around the animal and all around the animal, it's the same. So we call that radial symmetry. Bilateral symmetry is where an animal will have a distinct right and left side. So it's something where you can divide the animal in half and their 2 halves are going to be identical. They will have a head region and they'll have sort of an other region, tail region, but definitely bilateral. So we humans have bilateral symmetry, and we think about this as like a sea urchin or maybe not an octopus, but a jellyfish might have radial symmetry, right? All right, so this is our symmetry. Oh, sorry, looking at the notes, I forgot to mention a couple things. So under bilateral symmetry, you want to just be familiar with the words anterior and ventral and posterior or dorsal. So anterior and ventral means sort of the same thing. The anterior region of an animal is going to be the front of the animal. And so a lot of times this is going to contain the part that is the head or the face. So for us, our anterior surface is going to be the front of our bodies where our face is, right? And then the back is called the dorsal region or the posterior side. And so if animals have this bilateral symmetry, their ventral end or their anterior end will often contain the part that has the brain, and it has the area for vision, and so it's bundled up in this area, the head. The word ventral, if you have an animal like this lobster, since it's not standing straight up and down like we do, the ventral portion is going to be the one facing the earth, and the dorsal portion is going to be, or dorsal side is going to be the one that faces the sky. All right, so let's take a look at our phylogenetic tree here, right? So here's our ancestral protist, and then we have our tree where we can see our sponges are here, and then we have all different groups. So these different groups, this is what you're expected to have memorized by the end or by your exam. These are really good representative animals for each group. So let's look at the sponges, right? So Our ancestral protists, I mentioned before, right? Our sponges don't have any symmetry because they're tissues and they don't have organs. Their tissues are not super organized and they're actually not considered true tissues. So our sponges, even though they fit the 4 defining properties of animals, they're going to be sort of the most primitive. I don't want to use the word primitive, but they're going to be most resembling our ancestral protist. True tissues evolved here, and then everything else to the right of that is going to have true tissues. So when you have tissues, you have to have an organized body plan. So we're going to have symmetry now. We can see that there's only one group with radial symmetry, and that's going to be our cnidarians. This is going to be like our jellyfish. And then we have bilateral symmetry appearing, and all the rest of the animals have bilateral symmetry. Okay, so that's how you would read this. And we're going to move through the different animals. Now, letter B under animal structure says it's body cavities. And so many or most animals, right, except for sponges, will have cavities, fluid-filled spaces that separate their digestive tract from the rest of their body. And these cavities allow the organs to move and change shape. And the cavities are usually filled with fluid to cushion the organs from injury. That's not pictured here, but just so you know that animals are oftentimes categorized by their symmetry and whether or not they have body cavities. Let's take a look at our question here. What is the body plan feature shared by most animals? Okay, so what body plan is shared by most animals? And hopefully you said bilateral symmetry. That's the body plan, right, shared by most of our animals. The ones that don't fit are going to be sponges and cnidarians. All right, so looking at the rest of the lecture and animals, the most prevalent animal on the earth is going to be under the invertebrate category, invertebrates. Invertebrates are defined as animals without backbones. And so they're going to basically lack bones and lack this, critical backbone that we have. And then I've listed for you all the different phyla here that are invertebrates. And it turns out there's only one phylum that contains vertebrates. So most of the animals, right, 95% of the animal kingdom are going to be considered invertebrates. When you go and you take, if you were a biology major and you really liked animals, a lot of colleges will separate out. You can get a degree in invertebrate zoology or vertebrate zoology. So it's a big division. All right, so we're going to start off with our sponges, the phylum Porifera. So just looking at the title, right, what they named this group of animals, they're porous. They have pores. So they're called pore bearers. So the sponges are the phylum Porifera, hole bearers. So what are the characteristics of our sponges? A, the word sessile, you need to remember, is they don't move. Okay, so these are remember most animals can move, but not sponges. So sponges, they have to attach to a surface, a rock or whatever it is, and they just don't move. Their entire life, they're stuck to that. So they are anchored to rocks. Sponges will have a central cavity here. So they have a center where it's hollow. And then they're going to have their bodies arranged, loosely arranged in different kinds of cells. So you have a kind of cell called an amoebocyte that is in the wall. So let's take a look. It's these little blue guys. Those are going to be the ones that eat. Remember, amoebas are those protists that can crawl around. They phagocytose their prey. So these aren't really amoebas, but they are like amoebas in that they can phagocytose molecules. So they're going to help to eat. They're going to be basically the digestion cell for the sponge. Then you have these specialized cells here. They're flagellated. So they have a flagella, and they're going to help move the water. You see how the water is flowing through the holes of the sponge. So the sponge filters the water around it. So the water will come into the sponge because their flagellated cells here are creating a current. and the water will be sucked in. And the reason why the water's sucked in is so that the amoebocytes here get a constant flow of the ocean water, and in that ocean water will be a whole bunch of little tiny bacteria and debris from the ocean, and that's what the sponge will eat. So the flagellated cells create a current, the water comes into the central cavity, the amoebocytes will take in the nutrition, and then out goes the water in this top portion of the sponge. Also take a look at these little spicules, these skeletal fibers. Now these are not bones, right? But sponges do have a hard skeletal fibrous, these are called spicules, and a living sponge is actually going to be kind of hard. I know that you can buy sponges, like sort of natural sponges at the grocery store, and they are really cool to have in the bathtub, and they're soft. But that's after the people have removed those little tiny skeletal fibers from those sponges. Otherwise, it would really, really hurt to use a sponge on your body. Okay, and then the next parts is there's no nerves here to speak of. There's no muscles or organs here. It's just a collection of these cells. And you can see here there's different kinds of sponges. This is really cool picture. So this is a very fluorescent green colored dye that's harmless. And the research scientist puts the dye around the sponge. The sponge sucks in the water that's now been colored with the dye, and you can see how the sponge just shoots out that water from the top, right? So it's a filtering organ. Sponges come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. This is called a barrel sponge, which you can see is just, big or bigger than a person. And this is a barrel sponge that's spawning. So coming into that reproduction. So if you look at letter D, most sponges are hermaphrodites. A single organism is both male and female, so they can actually pump out both sperm and egg. The sperm and egg cells will come together within the water, and then when they fertilize, right, they'll land and then they'll grow into another sponge. So there's no true organs here, no nervous system, very, just organized in a loose way, but no true tissues as well with the phylum Porifera. So you want to remember a sponge as your organism to remember this phylum by. Okay, so moving on to the phylum Cnidaria. So the phylum Cnidaria, you don't say the C is silent, is named for its stinging cells. So the organisms in this phylum can all sting. Okay, so these are some different animals in the phylum Cnidaria. There's something called a hydra. These are tiny, and if we were in school, they actually have little living hydra. We can look at under the microscope. You can see them with the eye, but they're very, very small. They're like smaller than a grain of rice. This is the jellyfish, of course. This is the sea anemone. Here's both are sea anemones. And so the question here is, what type of body symmetry do cnidarians have? And if you remember from the flow chart, that phylogenetic tree, or maybe just looking at them, right? The anemone here has a really good representation. Is it bilateral symmetry or is it radial symmetry? And your answer should be radial. So I can't tell a distinct right and left because as I move around the animal, everything looks the same, right? So let's look at the body plans. Number 2, there are 2 body plans that this phylum has. One is called the polyp, and when the other, so this is a polyp, and the other body plan is Medusa. And really they're kind of the flipping of each other. So if you flip a polyp, you kind of get a Medusa. So a polyp is usually sessile, which means it does not move. So this part of the polyp sticks to a rock or sticks to the bottom of the water. And the Medusa is usually free floating. So this one obviously looks like a jellyfish, and yes, a Medusa is the shape that the jellyfish have, and they float around, right? And so those are basically the 2 shapes that these cnidarians have a lot of time. They have a single opening, a gastrovascular cavity. So in this region, they'll have a cavity, or if you go in here, right, this stomach, quote unquote stomach, and then or here there's an opening, and then there's our stomach. So this is where the digestion occurs in this area, and the tentacles of the polyp or the tentacles of the Medusa, their job is to sting their prey. So the prey is shocked and does not move. If it's powerful enough, the prey dies. And they use the tentacles to put the prey into their mouth and then digest it with their stomach, right? So let's take a look at the cnidocyte. So the word in red here, cnidocyte, is the cell that stings. So on their tentacles, right, embedded in the lining of their tentacles, there's a tiny microscopic cell, this cnidocyte, which has a trigger. So when you touch that, it causes these barbs inside the cell to come out. So there is a coiled thread in here. You discharge the thread when you hit that trigger, and then out comes this barb and it wraps around the prey and it stings, right? So there's venom or some kind of toxin that can be injected as well into the prey. And it either stuns the animal again or it can actually kill the animal. All right, so that is our phylum Cnidaria. So I'm going to go ahead and pause that. That's 2 phyla down. Moving on to the rest with our next segments.